Fort Carson in Montana, Fort Carson in Colorado is very much like Montana. So I set the conditions to get to 10th Group, and I wasn't there but a few months, and then we were off to Iraq.
So did you ever deploy to Afghanistan with 10th Group, or you went straight to your first deployment was to Iraq?
My first deployment was to Iraq. So we were on the ground prior to the war up in Kurdistan, setting the conditions, doing SF stuff. And then I was on rotations to Iraq all the way from 2003 until I went to Delta in 2005. I only went to Afghanistan a couple times with Delta, so I never really picked up an affinity for the country or the people. When I was with Delta, it was all very much direct action counterterrorism ops. We had a few Afghans that were with us just so we could say the Afghans were there, but I never really got to know or understood the Afghan people like I did the Iraqis and the Kurds.
Let me dig into that real quick because you're talking about setting the conditions for the invasion of Iraq. So the invasion starts, technically, the history books say March 20th, but I believe
Yeah.
Delta operators crossed the berm from Saudi Arabia on March 19th.
Yeah.
I believe that's public record, obviously, at this point. What is 10th Group? What's their role once the actual invasion kicks off and the war is underway? What was your unit's job?
Yeah. So even before the war kicked off, we began to infiltrate into Kurdistan. So we were coming in by land and air and mobilizing the Kurdish Peshmerga. So the plan, and this is all in the history books, the plan was for 10th Group to kind of open a northern front to tie down the units, the units that Saddam had up in the north, so they couldn't reposition, and to secure those oil fields and to really get the northern front taken care of, so that the actual attack that was coming from the south, again crossing the berm, didn't have to worry about reinforcements and all of that. So we were literally handfuls of men with thousands and thousands of Kurds, Peshmerga warriors, mobilizing them and getting them all set up. So we were equipping them, we were training them, we were trying to get their logistics set up. And I remember sitting in Kurdistan, like when the war kicked off, and that like someone had to tell us, oh, the war kicked off. And then I don't remember what day the 173rd Airborne actually jumped into Bashur Airfield, but we were sitting there in lawn chairs as they jumped in. I mean, it was we had set up the DZ and there were Peshmerga, everything was secured, and then once they hit the ground, things began to accelerate. And again, it's one of those things that when I think of warfare, it's almost easier to talk about that because it was linear. There was a front. There was an Iraqi front line of trenches and artillery, and when we approached them by fire and maneuver, like people would understand and recognize, it wasn't as dynamic, as complex as things definitely evolved into.
I've interviewed a handful of guys from C Squadron in Delta, and they said when they rolled into Iraq, they essentially just crushed. I mean, they just rolled through. There's obviously that famous April 2nd engagement where they fought the Fedayeen, but for the most part, they never faced any resistance that they couldn't crush. With your unit, when you were 10 Special Forces Group, what type of resistance were the Iraqis able to mobilize?
Not much at all. So keep in mind what I was involved in up there was very much front line. Like there was a forward line of troops, their forward line of troops, and these poor men that were in this trench, they were conscripts, man. Like,
Right.
and we softened them up with B-52 bombers, you know what I mean, stealth bombers. I mean, it really what we were trying to do was get them to quit. So we were prepared to fight, and we did fight, but by and large, we were there to demonstrate the air power, reinforced with what we were able to mobilize on the ground to say, hey, your best bet is just to surrender. That was when I learned the word capitulate. You just need to capitulate. And it was funny because that's what we were doing even before the war started. Is you'd be in this Kurdish village, and you'd be sitting here drinking tea and eating bread with the guy, and he'd call his buddy who was the Iraqi colonel. They had known each other, they had coexisted, and he'd basically saying, hey man, I'm here with the Americans. and tomorrow you need to surrender, and this is what surrendering looks like. And if you don't surrender, they're going to drop a whole shit ton of bombs on your head, and it just isn't going to be good. And they would negotiate, and you're like, all right, and I had money. We jumped in, landed. We landed with $8 million. I had $4 million in a backpack, and a friend of mine, Joe, he had $4 million in a backpack, and we were there to buy off the Iraqi army, so we didn't have to fight. So we would negotiate. Hey, how much is it going to cost for you to surrender? And I shit you not, man. Some of these guys would go for a couple packs of smokes. Because they were, we'd start at a couple packs of smokes, and then it would go up to hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million for a regiment, and like you were describing with some of these other guys you talked to, when we broke through that front line, it just collapsed. And there were just thousands of Iraqi men in uniform, out of uniform, walking in their underpants, just on the highway, walking south. Because one of the things that Saddam had done was the people that were fighting in the north were from the south. They were like from Basra and south of Baghdad. So it was far enough away where his thinking was they're not going to what do you call it when they defect or whatever, that they weren't going to leave because it was so far to get to their homes. But while that made sense in one area, they just had no affinity. Like they were down from Basra. They're sitting up here in the mountains of Kurdistan. Like it didn't connect. So I remember driving from when we broke through the lines finally into Kirkuk and Mosul. We're in white Toyota Hiluxes or Land Rovers, and there's just thousands of men. And once again, now I'm going back to like when I was a corporal. You're like, what do we do? Like this is our enemy. Like these guys were shooting at us 20 minutes ago. There were tanks idling on the side of the road, out of the side of the road. There were rocket vehicles with still rockets in the tube, artillery that still was primed with artillery shells in it. I mean, it was minutes, but quickly humanity takes over, and it's just like, hey man, good luck, and we were on to the next thing. And then though, so that's March, right? March, April. By June, some of us in special forces, because we had relationships with the locals, were beginning to understand, oh, that was easy, but it ain't over. They've gone to ground. And even some of those officers that we bought off in the north, we ended up fighting them again, in Tikrit, in Beji, and in Baghdad, So they were very, very clever in not going head to head against the Americans and disappearing into the populace and then creating this insurgency. And I'll pause there because I'm talking a lot, but I definitely want to share something with you that I don't know if anyone has ever talked about. So that's my teaser, but I'll break for something. Yeah, anything you've got.
Well, no, because you just brought up the insurgency, and